Imagine watching someone lose everything not because they were wrong, but because the system was never meant to protect them. Justice? Fairness? It's just a game for the powerful. And the worst part? You could be next. The funeral in the blizzard, the wind howled like a wounded beast, tearing through the small Norwegian town with an unforgiving fury. Snow swirled in every direction, blurring the line between sky and earth, as if the storm itself refused to let this day be ordinary. A group of townsfolk stood in the cemetery, bundled in heavy coats, their breath curling into the frozen air like ghosts of unspoken fears. The priest, Father Alden, gripped his Bible tightly, his fingers stiff with cold, but his voice was steady. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The words barely carried through the wind, swallowed whole by the storm. At the edge of the open grave lay Elsa's coffin, its black wood stark against the white abyss. She had been a schoolteacher, quiet, kind, a woman of simple means, but no one in town was speaking of her kindness now. They were whispering about something else. A young gravedigger, his face pale against the storm's bite, lifted a shovel and hesitated. He cast a wary glance at the priest before finally throwing the first scoop of dirt onto the coffin. The moment the soil touched the wood, the storm roared to life. A blast of wind howled through the cemetery, knocking over candles and sending the priest's robes billowing like a specter rising from the grave. Snow lashed at their faces. Somewhere in the distance, a pack of wolves let out a long, mournful howl. "God have mercy," someone whispered. The gravedigger stumbled back, his shovel clattering to the ground. His hands trembled as he made the sign of the cross. "I've dug graves all my life," he muttered, voice barely audible over the storm. "But never has the earth refused to take the dead." The murmurs among the mourners grew louder, laced with fear. "It's a sign," an old woman rasped. Her wrinkled hands clutched a rosary so tightly that her knuckles shone white. She did something to anger the land. A crow perched on the cemetery fence, watching. Silent, unmoving. Its black eyes reflected nothing but the storm. Martha, Elsa's only friend, wrapped her arms around herself and shook her head. "No, this isn't right." She turned to the priest, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't just leave her like this." But Father Alden's face was unreadable. He merely closed his Bible and turned away, the storm howling in his wake. And there, beneath the relentless snowfall, Elsa's coffin lay untouched, the grave refusing to swallow her. The earth would not have her, and neither would the storm. The storm raged long into the night, as if the heavens themselves refused to settle after what had happened at Elsa's burial. By morning, the town was blanketed in an eerie silence, the snow piled high on rooftops and pathways, muffling every sound. But the quiet did nothing to bury the whispers. Word spread fast. By midday, everyone in town had heard the same chilling tale: Elsa could not be buried. Inside the bakery, where the scent of fresh bread did little to warm the thick unease in the air, a group of women huddled near the counter. "Did you hear?" one of them whispered, her voice barely above the crackling fire. The wind howled the moment they threw the dirt on her coffin. Not just that, another woman leaned in. "The wolves, did you hear them?" It was like they were calling her name. At the butcher shop, men gathered, pretending to inspect cuts of meat while muttering in hushed voices. Father Alden wouldn't say a word after the funeral. A burly man grumbled, shaking his head. "If even the church won't talk about it, that means something's truly wrong." She wasn't normal, an older man with yellowed teeth muttered, always kept to herself. And that boy, that strange boy she took in, who knows what kind of child he really was. It wasn't long before fear turned into something else. Accusation. By nightfall, the storm had passed, but the town remained restless. The church doors creaked open for an emergency gathering, the wooden pews quickly filling with worried townsfolk. The flickering candlelight cast shadows against the stone walls, making the expressions on their faces seem even darker. Father Alden stood at the altar, his hands resting on the pulpit, his usual calm demeanor shadowed by something unreadable. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his voice grave, "you have all heard the rumors. You have all seen the signs. But this town does not belong to fear. It belongs to faith." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, clinging to his words like a lifeline. Others exchanged nervous glances, unconvinced. Then, from the back of the church, A voice broke through the murmurs. Faith won't explain why the ground refused to take Elsa. Heads turned. It was an older woman, her wrinkled hands gripping the end of a pew. Faith won't explain why the storm rose like the devil himself the moment she was put in the earth. Martha, sitting near the front, felt her pulse quicken. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palm. She was just a woman. Martha spoke, her voice steady but strained. A good woman, a schoolteacher, a friend. This isn't right. A scoff. A good woman? Someone sneered. A woman who brought a cursed child into our town? Who took in a boy that had no name, no past? Elsa saved that boy, Martha shot back, her anger rising. He was abandoned. She did what none of you would have. The room tensed. Father Alden lifted a hand, silencing them. His gaze swept over the crowd before he spoke again. The Lord sees all, he said carefully. And sometimes his punishment comes in ways we do not understand. The words hung heavy in the air. So, you think she was punished? Martha demanded, her voice shaking now. Father Alden hesitated. I think, he said slowly, that if Elsa's soul was pure, the ground would have accepted her. A sharp, collective inhale. The decision had been made. A cold certainty settled over the room. Elsa had not been a victim. She had been guilty. That night, the town seemed to hold its breath. Doors were locked. Candles burned low. And yet, no one truly slept. Martha sat by her window, staring at the snow-covered graveyard in the distance. She could just barely make out the shape of Elsa's coffin, still resting above ground, untouched by nature itself. A part of her wanted to believe it was all superstition. That fear had driven them to madness. But deep in her gut, something gnawed at her. Something was wrong. The wolves were getting closer. At the edge of the forest, just beyond the last row of houses, dark figures moved between the trees, silent, watching. Their eyes glowed faintly under the moonlight, flickering like dying embers. They did not run. They did not attack. They simply waited. And in the dead of night, a single, long howl cut through the silence, low and mournful, a sound that sent chills down Martha's spine. It was not the cry of an animal. It was a call, and something, or someone, was bound to answer. Martha couldn't sleep. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness over the town, but she could still hear the whispers, some in hushed voices from the streets, others echoing in her own mind. Elsa was cursed. The ground rejected her. The storm itself had risen to keep her above the earth, but Martha knew Elsa. She wasn't cursed. She wasn't wicked. And if the town refused to remember who she really was, then Martha would. So, just before dawn, she wrapped a thick shawl around her shoulders and left her house, heading toward the place where it all began. It had been another brutal winter night, much like this one, the kind where the cold cut through even the thickest furs, where the snow swallowed footprints within seconds. The bells of the church had rung their usual evening chime, signaling the last mass of the night. The town had already been asleep, tucked away behind locked doors and shuttered windows. And that was when Elsa had found him. She had been walking home from the schoolhouse when she heard it, a sound barely louder than the wind, a soft, broken wail. At first, she thought she was imagining it. The storm played cruel tricks on the ears. But then she heard it again, a weak, desperate cry. She followed the sound to the steps of the church, and there, in the thick of the snow, wrapped in nothing but a thin, tattered blanket, was a baby. His lips were blue, his tiny fingers curled in pain from the cold. He was barely clinging to life. Elsa hadn't hesitated. She had lifted the child into her arms, cradling him against her chest, shielding him from the wind. The moment he felt warmth, he stopped crying. His tiny body trembled, but he did not make a sound. She looked around, expecting to see someone, his mother, his father, anyone who might have left him there. But the streets were empty. The church doors were locked. Who would abandon a baby in the middle of a snowstorm? Elsa had taken the baby home that night. She had wrapped him in her own blankets, sat by the fire, and held him close until the color returned to his cheeks. And when morning came, she had gone to the church, the child still in her arms, demanding answers. Father Alden had been waiting for her. You should not have taken him. His voice had been cold. He was left in God's hands, Elsa. You were not meant to interfere. God's hands. Elsa had shot back. He would have died, but the priest did not flinch. His expression remained unreadable. Perhaps that was his will. The words had hit her like a slap. She had never been particularly religious, but she had always believed in goodness, in kindness, in the idea that life, every life, was worth saving. "I don't care what you say," she had told him, gripping the child tighter. "I'm keeping him." She named him Liam, and from that moment on, the town never looked at her the same way again. At first, the whispers were subtle. Where did he come from? No mother, no father. Just appeared in the snow? That's not natural. Then, the rumors grew darker. No woman raises a child alone unless she has something to hide. She should have left him where he belonged. That boy was abandoned for a reason. Elsa never let it break her. She held her head high. She taught Liam to read, to count, to see the world with wonder despite the way the town shunned him. She protected him. But the stares never stopped, and neither did the fear. The older women would clutch their rosaries when Elsa and Liam passed by. The butcher refused to let her buy meat from his shop. Children were told not to speak to Liam. And worst of all things started happening. Small things at first. A villager's cow mysteriously dying in the night. The church bells ringing on their own during storms. The fire at the schoolhouse snuffing out inexplicably, even though no wind had touched it. No one had proof. But that didn't matter. They had already decided. Elsa and her son were cursed. Martha stood in front of Elsa's abandoned house, staring at the frost-covered windows. The town had been cruel to her friend. It had turned its back on Elsa, had treated her with suspicion and hatred. And for what? Because she saved a child, and now that child was gone, and Elsa was dead. Martha shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She didn't believe in curses, but she did believe in revenge. And if the town had been wrong about Elsa, about Liam, then maybe the storm wasn't finished with them yet. The night Liam vanished was the coldest the town had ever known. The storm came without warning, a brutal, howling force that swallowed the sky and earth in an endless sheet of white. Windows rattled. Doors groaned against the wind. The streets, once lined with glowing lanterns, flickered into darkness as the storm smothered every flame. And somewhere in the chaos, Liam was gone. Elsa's screams cut through the storm like a blade. "Liam!" Her voice was raw, torn apart by the wind, but she kept calling, kept searching. Her boots sank deep into the snow as she ran through the streets, her breath coming in frantic gasps. The storm lashed at her face, freezing the tears that spilled down her cheeks. She pounded on doors, her fists numb from the cold. "Have you seen him? Please, Liam is missing." But no one opened their doors. No one answered. They had heard the rumors for too long, had whispered about the boy's unnatural presence, about the strange things that seemed to happen whenever he was near. And now, with the storm raging and Elsa's voice carrying through the night, the town did what it always did best. It turned away. She stumbled through the snow, her feet carrying her toward the one place. She had sworn never to return to the church. The doors stood closed, but a dim light glowed behind the stained glass windows. She shoved them open. Inside, the warmth of burning candles clashed against the cold that clung to her skin. At the front of the church, standing as if he had been waiting for her, was Father Alden. He did not look surprised. "You took him." Her voice was hoarse, her breath ragged. Father Alden folded his hands in front of him, his expression unreadable. "That child was never yours to keep, Elsa." Her heart pounded in her chest. "Where is he?" she demanded. "What have you done?" The priest exhaled slowly as if he pitied her. "You should have left him where he was meant to be." Her hands shook. She wanted to scream, to tear the church apart until she found Liam, but a part of her already knew the truth. Liam was gone, taken, or worse. Her knees buckled, but she caught herself against the pew. The warmth of the church felt suffocating, the candlelight flickering like dying hope. "You'll burn for this," she whispered. Father Alden did not flinch. God's will is not ours to question. She met his eyes then, and for the first time she saw it fear, not of her, but of something else, something bigger than him, something he had tried to bury. And that was when she realized this wasn't just about Liam. She ran, out of the church, through the snow. The storm still raged, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop. Somewhere out there, Liam was waiting for her. Somewhere out there, her son was alone. But as she stumbled through the night, one thought clawed at the back of her mind, sinking its teeth into her fear. If Liam was still alive, why were the wolves howling? And why did it sound like they were mourning? The church was dark, except for the soft flicker of candlelight casting trembling shadows along the stone walls. The storm had eased, but an unsettling stillness hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Martha moved cautiously, her breath shallow, her hands trembling as she flipped through the old, dust-covered records stacked inside Father Alden's study. She knew she was running out of time. If anyone caught her here, if Alden caught her here, she would suffer the same fate as Elsa. But she had to know. She had to know what really happened to Liam. Her fingers brushed against an old leather-bound book, tucked beneath piles of unused hymn sheets. The edges were worn, the cover marked with a faded cross. This was no ordinary church ledger. She pried it open, her eyes scanning the yellowed pages. The handwriting was neat but rigid, as if whoever had written it had been trying too hard to control their trembling hand. And then she found it. A name. Liam, date of founding, winter, year X, 2, T, N. She swallowed hard. The entry was brief, devoid of any warmth or care. A child left at the steps of the church. No record of parents, no baptism. Taken in for divine judgment. Her stomach twisted. Divine judgment? She flipped the page. The next entry was written in the same hand, but the words were darker, as if pressed harder into the paper. The boy is unnatural. The elders agree. There are signs. He should not remain. A sharp breath left her lips. She turned another page, and there it was, the final entry. Judgment has been passed. The child will be returned to the earth. His presence must be cleansed. Martha felt the blood drain from her face. They killed him. The realization struck her like ice in her veins. Liam hadn't disappeared. He had been taken. The church had stolen him from Elsa, and when no one was looking, when the storm had masked their sins, they had erased him. Her fingers gripped the edge of the book as nausea churned in her stomach. No, 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 no. She clamped a hand over her mouth, trying to keep herself from making a sound. A sudden creak of the wooden floorboards made her freeze. Martha's breath caught. She wasn't alone. The heavy door to the study groaned open, and a dark figure stepped inside. Martha barely had time to shove the book behind her before Father Alden's cold, knowing voice filled the room. You shouldn't be here, Martha. She turned slowly, heart pounding, hands gripping the edge of the desk. The candlelight flickered across his face, casting his sharp features into harsh lines. But there was something else in his expression, something beyond anger, something like fear. You knew, Martha whispered. You knew he wasn't abandoned. You knew what happened to him and you let it happen. Father Alden remained still, his face unreadable. It was never your place to question God's will. Martha's fingers dug into the wood. Don't you dare. This wasn't God. This was you. For the first time, the priest's mask cracked. His eyes flickered, just for a second, before he took a slow step forward. The child was never meant to stay, he said, voice eerily calm. We did what had to be done. You cannot begin to understand the danger he posed. Martha clenched her jaw. Danger, yes. His gaze darkened. There were things we saw, things we cannot explain. The storm, every time it came, it was stronger. The wolves, they never left the edge of the town after he arrived. The boy, he was not like us. Martha's stomach churned with fury. He was a child, Alden. A child who did nothing but exist. The priest exhaled slowly. And that was the problem. Martha took a step back. She needed to get out. She needed to tell someone, anyone, what she had found. But the moment she moved, Alden's voice stopped her. You shouldn't have come here. The candle flames flickered violently, casting frantic shadows along the walls. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Outside, the wind picked up again. And then, boom! The entire church shook as something slammed into the doors. Martha gasped, spinning toward the entrance. Alden's face paled. He heard it, too. Another thud, then another, and then a howl. Low, deep. Unlike any wolf Martha had ever heard before, Alden stepped back, his lips parting slightly. For the first time, the priest looked truly afraid. "It's too late," he whispered. Martha's breath hitched. The wolves had come, and they were no longer waiting. The church doors shook violently, the wooden beams groaning under the pressure of whatever was outside. The air inside had turned heavy, thick with something unseen, something neither divine nor human. Martha's pulse pounded in her ears. She could still hear the howling, but now there was something else, footsteps crunching against the snow. Slow, deliberate, not wolves. Something more. Father Alden's face was drained of color. He clutched the cross around his neck, as if it might shield him from what was coming. "It's him," he whispered. "He's come back." Martha felt the blood drain from her face. Liam. The doors burst open. A gust of wind howled through the church, snuffing out the candles in an instant. Snow spiraled inside, a blinding white mist that carried a presence within it, a shadow stepping through the threshold. A boy stood there. No, not a boy, not anymore. The figure in the doorway was small, barely more than a child. His hair was wild, tangled with snowflakes. His skin was pale, too pale. His eyes, Martha felt her breath catch in her throat. His eyes were not human. A cold, piercing blue, glowing faintly like the heart of a winter storm. "Liam." Martha's voice was barely above a whisper. He turned his head, slow, almost curious, as if tasting the sound of his own name. Then he looked at Alden. The priest stumbled backward, shaking his head. "No," Alden muttered. "This isn't real. This isn't possible." But Liam took a step forward, and the temperature in the church plummeted. Frost spread across the stone floor, slithering like veins of ice. The wooden pews creaked as if groaning in pain. The stained glass windows, so carefully crafted over decades, began to crack, fine fractures webbing outward like fragile bones breaking under pressure. What are you?" Alden's voice was barely a breath now. Liam tilted his head. Then he spoke. "You tried to bury me." His voice was quiet, childlike, but wrong. It carried layers beneath it. Something old, something endless like the whisper of the wind before a blizzard consumes the world. Alden fell to his knees. "Forgive me, we were afraid. You were never meant to be here." The candles flickered back to life blue flames. Unnatural, cold. The wooden cross above the altar split down the center with a deafening crack. The wolves had entered the church now, silent, watching, their eyes glowing in the dim light. They did not attack. They were waiting for his command. Martha forced herself to move, to step forward. "Liam," she said, voice firm but gentle. "You don't have to do this." The boy turned to her, those unnatural eyes studying her face. For a moment, something flickered in them, a memory, a shadow of who he once was. "You were the only one who was kind." His voice was softer now, less layered, more human. Hope surged in Martha's chest. "Yes," she whispered, "I was. And Elsa, she loved you. She died trying to save you." The wolves stirred. The storm outside softened, just slightly. But then, and he let it happen. Liam turned back to Alden. The storm roared to life once more. The priest sobbed, hands raised in supplication. "Please, please, have mercy." Liam's expression did not change. "Did you have mercy?" The words struck like a knife. Alden opened his mouth to speak, but the frost reached him first. A chilling wind wrapped around his body, his breath coming in sharp gasps as ice crept up his hands, his arms, his throat. His eyes were wide, unblinking, frozen in silent horror as the cold consumed him. In seconds, he was nothing more than a statue of ice. The church was silent. Martha shivered, her breath curling in the air. "Liam." She tried again, but the boy, the thing Liam had become, only turned toward the door. "It's done." The wolves followed as he stepped into the snow, disappearing into the night. The wind died down. The flames of the candles dimmed, and for the first time in years, the town of Eckland fell into an unnatural, haunting silence. By dawn, Father Alden's frozen body was gone. Only a patch of untouched frost remained where he had knelt. The town awoke to a world changed. Elsa's coffin had disappeared from the graveyard. The wolves had vanished. And the storm, the endless, relentless winter that had plagued the town for years, had lifted. But no one celebrated, because they all knew the truth now. They had tried to bury a child, and the earth had refused. Morning came, but the town of Eklund did not stir. The air was thick with silence, the kind that pressed against the chest, heavy and unmoving. The sky, once perpetually gray with the weight of winter storms, now stretched vast and pale blue overhead. The snow had stopped falling. The wind had stilled. For the first time in years, the town was no longer trapped in the endless grasp of the storm, but no one dared to step outside. They had all seen what happened the night before. They had all heard the whispers in the wind, the howling of the wolves, the final, agonized gasp of Father Alden before he was swallowed by the ice. And most terrifying of all, they knew who had done it. Liam, or whatever Liam had become. Martha was the first to venture out. She stepped onto the frozen ground, her boots crunching softly in the snow, the sound unnaturally loud in the eerie quiet. Her breath curled into the air in soft clouds, but for the first time in a long while, the cold didn't bite quite as hard. Her eyes scanned the graveyard, drawn immediately to the place where Elsa's coffin had been. It was gone, not just moved, not just disturbed, gone. Only the untouched snow remained, smooth as if nothing had ever been buried there in the first place. A shiver not from the cold, but from something deeper ran down Martha's spine. Had the earth finally accepted Elsa? Or had something else taken her? She turned her gaze to the forest beyond the graveyard, to the endless stretch of dark trees that loomed just beyond the town's edge. The same forest where the wolves had gathered. Something was watching her. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it. A presence, not malevolent, not kind, just there. She exhaled slowly. Liam. She knew somehow that she would never see him again. Not in the way she had known him before. The doors of the church remained wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. No one dared to step inside. Not after what they had seen. By noon, Father Alden's frozen body had disappeared. There were no footprints leading away from the church, no shattered ice, no sign of struggle. It was as if he had never existed at all. But the walls remembered, the deep cracks in the stone, the frost still clinging to the altar, the pews warped with ice, a scar left on holy ground. No one would pray there anymore. No one would dare. That night, as the town of Eklund locked its doors and whispered prayers to a God they were no longer sure was listening, a child appeared at the steps of the church. Small, silent, barefoot in the snow. His hair was wild, tangled with frost. His eyes too blue, too sharp, too knowing. An old woman peeked through her window and gasped, clutching her rosary to her chest. It couldn't be. It couldn't be. But she knew it was. The child raised his head, staring at the empty church, the abandoned altar, the town that had betrayed him. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze toward her window. His lips curled into a small, knowing smile. And before she could scream, he was gone. Only the wind remained, curling through the streets in a whisper that sent chills down the spine of anyone who heard it. Not a warning, not a threat, just a reminder. The storm may have passed, but the curse was never lifted. Imagine watching someone lose everything not because they were wrong, but because the system was never meant to protect them. Justice? Fairness? It's just a game for the powerful. And the worst part? You could be next. Have you ever felt powerless in the face of injustice? Tell me your story in the comments. If the system isn't built to protect us, we must stand together to change it.